January 1945. A cold wind sweeps across the shattered medical outpost on Luzon, carrying the smell of damp earth and burnt palm leaves. The rain hasn't stopped for 2 days. It taps against torn canvas sheets that once served as shelter for the last remaining Japanese nurses, women who have not slept in more than a day, whose uniforms cling to their skin with mud and sweat. They stand motionless as American infantry approach, rifles lowered but ready. The nurses expect the worst. They had been told surrender meant humiliation, punishment, or death. Instead, the Americans lead them toward a field aid station set up inside a reclaimed farm shed. A single iron stove glows in the corner, its orange light cutting through the gray of the storm. The first burst of warm air hits their faces. Some flinch, one steps back, unsure if it's a trick. Another's knees give way, caught between fear and pure exhaustion. An American medic instinctively reaches out, steadying her before guiding the group closer to the heat. For the first time in days, their shivering slows, and in that moment of stunned silence, the broader story of how they reached this place begins to unfold. By early 1945, the Pacific War had reached a breaking point. American forces were advancing across Luzon with overwhelming strength, while Japanese units were collapsing under shortages, disease, and constant bombardment. Medical detachments once organized and supplied were now isolated groups, struggling to keep themselves alive, let alone the wounded. Japanese nurses served at the edge of this unraveling front. Most were trained in strict discipline, taught to endure hardship, and repeatedly warned that surrender was unthinkable. Propaganda had painted Americans as brutal enemies. For these women, the idea of capture carried a terror deeper than the battlefield itself. But reality around them was deteriorating faster than doctrine could hold it together. Field hospitals ran out of medicine, tents were shredded by artillery, clean water became scarce, many nurses treated infections with boiled river water and bandages torn from their own uniforms. Hunger became constant, fatigue became crippling. On Luzon, entire medical units were pushed into the mountains as Japanese defensive lines collapsed. One such group, exhausted, drenched by days of rain, and carrying the last of their supplies, found themselves stranded with no communication and no orders. Their wounded had died or been abandoned. Their location no longer mattered. Survival was now a matter of hours. When an American patrol finally located them, the nurses had almost no strength left to resist. What followed would challenge every belief they held about the enemy, setting the stage for the moment beside the warm stove. As the battle for Luzon intensified, the terrain itself became an enemy. Torrential rain cut through ravines, washed out trails, and turned every hillside into mud. Japanese formations that once defended the mountains were now fragmented groups moving without coordination. Medical units, already weakened, were among the first to be left behind. For the nurses, the collapse felt sudden. Their original clinic had been overrun by artillery strikes, forcing them to flee with only what they could carry. They moved deeper into the interior, hoping to find retreating Japanese soldiers. But the front had shifted faster than they could travel. Every direction led to signs of retreat, abandoned equipment, destroyed supply caches, and wounded men who could no longer be evacuated. Food disappeared quickly. Fires were impossible to light in the constant rain. Several nurses fainted from exhaustion. The youngest, barely trained, wept quietly at night, convinced that capture would bring violence or execution. Their only guidance came from warnings repeated since training. Americans would show no mercy. But the Americans moving through the same terrain were operating under very different principles. Their orders emphasized securing prisoners, especially medical personnel, who were often cooperative and carried valuable information. Patrols advancing through the forest expected resistance but often encountered silence. One of those patrols would soon step into the clearing, where the nurses had gathered, bringing an encounter none of the women had imagined. For the nurses, the first minutes after capture were defined by fear more than awareness. They had spent years hearing warnings that Americans would treat them with cruelty. Yet, as they were brought into the aid station, nothing matched those expectations. Instead of shouting or striking, the Americans kept their voices steady. Instead of threats, they offered blankets. The shock was not dramatic, was slow, quiet, and overwhelming. Most of the women were severely dehydrated. Their hands trembled from cold and malnutrition. Even standing upright felt like an effort. When they entered the small shed where the stove burned, the change in temperature felt unreal. Warmth in wartime often came only from fire. and fire usually meant destruction. Here, it meant comfort. This emotional contrast was powerful. The nurses hesitated to move closer, as if the warmth was something forbidden. Their expressions shifted between fear, disbelief, and a kind of exhaustion so deep it barely allowed them to react. One woman covered her face, expecting punishment for approaching the stove without permission. Another stared at the Americans as though trying to understand why they were not behaving like the monsters she had been taught to imagine. Human shock is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is the simple inability to process kindness after months of hardship. In that moment, the stove was not just a heat source, which was evidence that the world outside propaganda was different from what they had been told. The American decision to escort the nurses to warmth was not accidental. The US military had a clear and structured policy regarding enemy medical personnel. While the Pacific War was brutal on both sides, American field commanders generally enforced the treatment of prisoners according to established regulations. Medical staff were considered valuable for their knowledge of unit movements, casualty conditions, and logistical shortages. This approach aligned with broader US strategy, gathering intelligence without unnecessary violence. Frontline medics, especially in the Pacific, were trained to stabilize any wounded individual they encountered, regardless of nationality. Many had already treated Japanese soldiers who surrendered from caves or bunkers, and they were accustomed to the shock, fear, and malnutrition that accompanied such captures. Bringing the nurses inside served multiple purposes. It prevented hypothermia, ensured they remained fit for questioning, and reduced the chance of panic or self-harm. American commanders had observed that Japanese troops, especially women, were often so convinced of mistreatment that they might resist, even when unable to fight. Providing warmth and care helped stabilize them physically and emotionally. From a tactical viewpoint, securing medical staff alive also prevented further risks. Desperate captives could lash out if cornered. Calm captives rarely did. The stove, the blankets, and the food were not only humanitarian gestures, they were tools to ensure safety, order, and compliance. Yet even with these practical considerations, many American medics acted out of personal conviction. They had seen enough suffering to know that war did not need additional cruelty. Saving a life, even that of an enemy, was an act rooted in duty and humanity. That combination of policy and compassion shaped every decision made in the shed. That night, the Japanese nurses carried into captivity a lifetime of conditioning. From the beginning of the war, Japanese state messaging emphasized the brutality of Western soldiers, claiming they would commit immediate violence against female captives. This propaganda was crafted to maintain morale and prevent surrender, but its effects were profound. Many nurses believed that being taken alive was worse than dying in combat. This mindset created a psychological battlefield. Long before the nurses ever saw American troops, even as their physical bodies weakened, their fear remained strong. When the Americans approached their clearing, several nurses instinctively braced for assault. Even surrender felt dangerous, but what they encountered disrupted every expectation. The Americans did not shout, they did not mock, they did not demand confessions. Instead, they asked if the women were injured and offered canteens of water. The soft tone of the medics confused the nurses more than aggression would have. Their training had never prepared them for humane treatment. In many ways, this interaction became its own form of psychological turning point. When an enemy rejects the role your government assigned him, the narrative begins to collapse. The nurses found themselves in a world where the people they feared most were the ones offering the warmth they desperately needed. For the Americans, there was no need to win hearts and minds in the tactical sense, but the simple act of caring for their captives, letting them rest, feeding them, and warming them, a silent but undeniable crack in the ideology that had shaped the nurses' lives, and that shift in perception would set the stage for the dramatic turning point that followed. The women who arrived at the American aid station carried more than exhaustion. They carried years of ideological conditioning. Japanese wartime nursing schools emphasized discipline, sacrifice, and loyalty to the emperor. Their textbooks described American forces as ruthless invaders who would never spare captives, especially women. Teachers repeated these warnings until they became instinctive truths. The Americans caring for the nurses had their own experiences shaping their actions. Pacific medics worked under relentless conditions: malaria, heat, jungle rot, and the constant flow of wounded men. They saw suffering every day, sometimes with so few supplies that improvisation became second nature. For them, treating Japanese captives was not unusual. Many had already stabilized wounded enemy soldiers after cave surrenders or night assaults. Their training stressed that medical duty did not end at national lines. Saving life came before politics. When the nurses entered the shed, the Americans read the signs immediately: dehydration, shock, hypothermia, and fear. Their response, offering warmth and calm instructions, reflected a culture of battlefield. Medical care built on steadiness rather than aggression. In that moment, the nurses were simply patients. The interaction at the stove revealed a deep cultural gap between two wartime worlds. In Japan, surrender carried lifelong shame, and women in uniform were expected to fight or die rather than fall into enemy hands. In the American military, surrender was a strategic choice, not a moral failure. These opposing beliefs collided the moment the nurses realized they were not going to be harmed. For the Americans, offering a warm stove was routine. For the nurses, it was an emotional rupture, a moment where fear met reality and could not withstand it. That cultural divide did not disappear instantly, but it softened. For the first time, the nurses saw their captors not as threats, but as human beings making room for them in the warmth. The moment the nurses stepped inside the shed, everything they believed about the enemy collided with reality. Rainwater dripped from their sleeves onto the wooden floor. Their legs shook from fatigue. Yet the Americans did not push or restrain them. They simply guided the women toward the stove, speaking slowly so the nurses could understand the gestures even if not the words. One nurse hesitated at the edge of the heat, clutching her medical pouch as if it were a shield. Her training told her that accepting kindness from the enemy was dangerous. Her body, however, trembled violently from the cold. The medic closest to her placed a blanket across her shoulders without a word. She stiffened, expecting a trap. Instead, the warmth settled around her like a weight. She could finally stop fighting. Another nurse, barely able to stand, swayed forward and instinctively reached toward the stove with both hands. The moment her fingers felt the heat, her knees gave out. An American medic caught her before she hit the ground and eased her onto a folding chair. Her breathing slowed, no longer shallow with fear but heavy with exhaustion. Food came next. A canteen of warm broth was passed carefully among them. They accepted it with trembling hands, unsure whether they were allowed to drink it. The medics nodded gently, encouraging them to take small sips. These gestures, simple, practical, unthreatening, began to erode the fear that had held the nurses rigid since the moment of capture. The stove's glow illuminated their faces, revealing shock slowly giving way to relief. And as the warmth settled deeper into their bones, a shift occurred. The nurses realized these men were not the monsters they had been told to expect. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere inside the shed changed from tense to strangely calm. The nurses no longer stood rigidly near the walls. Their shoulders dropped. Their breathing steadied. The instinct to resist slowly faded under the steady reassurance of warmth, food, and silence. An American medic performed brief checks, lifting hands to feel pulse strength, examining pupils, and assessing dehydration. The nurses reacted with confusion rather than fear. Medical care from the enemy was something none of them had imagined. When one nurse flinched as he touched her wrist, he paused and stepped back slightly, giving her time. That gesture of patience spoke louder than any words. The most striking moment came when the youngest nurse, overwhelmed by exhaustion, slumped sideways in her chair. Two medics moved instantly, supporting her head and covering her with an additional blanket. She did not resist. She simply closed her eyes, accepting help for the first time since the retreat began. The stove crackled softly, its light reflecting on faces that no longer looked terrified, just tired. For the nurses, the realization settled quietly. Survival was possible, and the men before them intended no harm. This turning point would shape everything that followed. The hours after the nurses' arrival at the American aid station marked the beginning of a new, unfamiliar chapter in their lives. Once their condition stabilized, the medics documented each woman's injuries, recorded dehydration levels, and distributed ration portions specifically prepared for weakened captives. None of this resembled the horrors they had been warned about. Instead, the procedures were calm, methodical, and rooted in the same medical discipline the nurses had followed on their own side of the war. When transport vehicles arrived, the women were escorted carefully, never rushed, never handled roughly. The ride to the rear area holding facility was quiet. Some nurses stared out the open truck slats, watching terrain they had crossed in fear now pass under a different kind of silence. Others kept their eyes lowered, still processing the shift from anticipated brutality to unexpected safety. At the temporary POW center, the women received clean clothing, bedding, and regulated meals. A separate space was arranged for female captives to ensure privacy and security. American medical officers conducted follow-up examinations, noting malnutrition, infections, and prolonged exposure to cold. Treatment was consistent: antibiotics where possible, hydration therapy, and supervised rest. Every step contradicted the image of the enemy they once carried. Over the following days, the nurses began to regain strength. Their posture changed. Their voices returned. Some offered simple bows to the medics who checked on them. Others avoided eye contact, unsure how to navigate an environment that did not match their expectations. Reports from these facilities noted the same pattern repeated across the Pacific. Japanese medical personnel, once convinced they would face abuse, often expressed quiet astonishment at the humane conditions. Though few spoke openly at first, their body language revealed a gradual acceptance that surrender had not meant dishonor or death. It had meant survival. For the Americans, this outcome reflected broader military policy. Treating prisoners well reduced resistance, encouraged future surrenders, and upheld international standards. But for the nurses, it carried a different weight. Their survival became a personal contradiction to the narrative. They had lived under 4 years, that in the calm that followed their rescue, as they rested on cots beneath canvas roofs, instead of huddling in rain-soaked ravines. One truth grew clearer. The moment beside the warm stove had not been an exception, but the beginning of a reality they had never been taught to imagine. War often reveals its harshest truths in moments of exhaustion, hunger, and fear. Yet it also reveals small acts that carry unexpected weight, acts that break through layers of propaganda, reshape beliefs, and remind individuals of their shared humanity. For the Japanese nurses on Luzon, the warm stove in the American aid station became such a moment. It was not dramatic in appearance. It did not change the course of a battle, but it changed the course of their understanding. The nurses had lived under a system that framed surrender as a fate worse than death, and the enemy as incapable of mercy. Their world was built from duty, discipline, and fear. But when the stove's warmth reached them, when blankets replaced threats, and when calm voices replaced warnings of brutality, the foundation of that world cracked. What replaced it was not trust. Trust comes slowly, but recognition. Recognition that the men caring for them were not the enemies imagined in training rooms and wartime broadcasts, but human beings shaped by their own codes, their own hardships, and their own hopes for survival. The Americans, too, witnessed something meaningful. They saw enemy nurses who had carried the same burdens they did: cold nights, wounded comrades, impossible decisions. They treated them not as symbols of the opposing army, but as individuals caught in the same vast machinery of war. In the quiet days that followed, as the nurses regained strength, the memory of that first encounter lingered. It suggested that beneath uniforms and orders, even in one of the most violent theaters of the war, empathy could surface where least expected. History often records battles and strategies, victories and defeats, but the moment beside the warm stove reminds us that sometimes the most enduring lessons come from simple gestures that soften fear, preserve life, and leave behind a memory of humanity in the middle of destruction.